Hello and good day to all our listeners and viewers who watch us from different parts around the world, and welcome once again to this section of INISEG Cast created to analyze and discuss every single one of the political and social events that happen in society. Today we have a special guest, Lieutenant Colonel Roger Cirillo. He served in the U.S. Army from 1971-1995 and retired with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He served in armored cavalry units in the United States, Korea, and West Germany, and on the staff and faculty of the Air Defense and Armor Schools. He was a War Plans officer at the Central Army Group NATO and served in the office of the CINC and USAREUR. He taught military history at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, and holds a Ph.D. in military history from Cranfield University at the Royal Military College of Science, Shrivenham from UK. He is the author of Ardennes-Alsace Campaign and assists in the publication of more than 30 military history books for the Association of the U.S. Army. So, Roger, welcome to our channel. It's a pleasure for us to have you here today in INISEG Cast.
Thank you very much.
So today we will talk about Roger's military career and his time in NATO. We also talk about his participation as a historian in the World War II. And of course, we will talk about his incredible book, The Ardennes-Alsace Campaign. So Roger, I want to start with some important question for you. You were a War Plans officer in the NATO Central Army Group, but how do you see the current situation of the alliance between the US and Europe? And based on that, could we say that finally Europe will create our forces?
Well, the situation now is significantly different than it was from when I served in Europe. I served in Europe from 1977 to 1980, and again from 1985 to 1991. During the 1970s, there was tension between the NATO allies and the Warsaw Pact. It was very apparent that the possibility of a war existed because of the large number of Warsaw Pact forces that were on the East German border and across Europe. At the time, there were almost 30 Russian divisions in East Germany alone. At the time, the U.S. had 4.5 divisions serving in West Germany, and then there was a total of about 14 divisions within our Army group. We had the ability to go to full alert and eventually raise to 25 divisions. The period then was one of, we were prepared to receive an attack from the Soviet Union to stop it from going into Western Europe. By the time I returned to Germany in 1985, we found that there was a significantly different situation. The Allies had grown much, much stronger together, and the Soviet Union was suffering from very extreme economic problems. And of course, this eventually brought the end to communism and the fall of the wall. I can tell you that as a young soldier, having seen communists through barbed wire in Korea, and then again, the 3 years I spent on the West German border from 77 to 80, that it was a complete surprise to me that the communist threat that just disappeared. I think that the problem that NATO faces now is one of defining what it wants to be, not only from day to day, but in the future. There is no clear-cut Russian threat anymore because there is no Soviet Union. There is a belief, I believe, within NATO that it could expand economically and somewhat militarily to the east. And I think in a lot of cases that is the wrong illusion. I happened to meet yesterday at the convention of the Association of the U.S. Army, an officer from the Ukraine, and he serves on the NATO staff. And I can tell you that from the Russian perspective, that having members in the Ukraine and places to the east poses a potential threat to them emotionally. I don't think it's a significant military threat at all. I don't think that NATO is an aggressive coalition. But the Soviets traditionally are very defensive in their stance, and they're very paranoid. And I think that we have to assure them that NATO is as much a political unification of countries and an economic unification of countries than it is militarily. The US right now questions why I believe that it needs military strength in Europe. There's a belief that we need to pull out, and I personally believe that the United States should provide a presence to show that it is dedicated to peace in Europe, but not a dominance. I think it's time for NATO to become a European commanded coalition, not an American commanded coalition. But that's only my opinion. Certainly not one that the generals in the US Army would agree with.
Oh, perfect. By the other hand, in your opinion about the current US strategy military alliance, what do you think about AUKUS? Do you think that is alliance that can be complement with NATO, or maybe is it the beginning of the substitution of this North Atlantic alliance?
I think that the Atlantic alliance has an awful long way to go to proving that it has a capability on its own. And that's a problem, because you have to get all the nations to contribute a fair share. That means that the larger nations contribute more, and the less economically strong or heavily populated nations can contribute less. And that has always been a problem. Burden sharing within a coalition is a very large problem, because in a lot of ways, it defines who has influence. The people who pay the most have the largest influence, and the people that pay the least feel that they aren't taken care of by the larger nations. And I think that that is something that develops over a long period of time, not a short period of time. It would be nice if there could be a US equality with the European nations, and not a US dominance. I think that the United States was dominant for 75 years, and I think that it's time for us to evolve away from that stance, that political feeling that you can't have peace unless the United States is there, because that's no longer true. I don't think the Soviet Union, by the way, is offensive in its natural state. I think that they want to expand economically, and they want to participate in the world as an equal member, but they keep a military force as a member, as a way of emotionally stating that they are equal. And I think we have to come to grips with that. I think that the national leaders have to come to grips with that. That the only way to have peace is to have equals.
Yeah, exactly. And by the other thing, you have taught military history at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, but about all the war campaigns that U.S. has had, what do you think that had been the mistakes that had been made and we are still not learning from history?
Well, I think that the biggest mistakes in Europe's wars was the belief that the end of the war meant peace, because what it eventually did was it led to an inequality, and it led to nations feeling a grudge or put upon by other nations, and it led to another war. The reason that did not happen after the Second World War because of the complete onset of nuclear weapons. That as terrible as nuclear weapons are, they guaranteed peace because nobody wanted to be in a nuclear war. I think now that we've had proof that nations can coexist for 75 years in Europe, that there is virtually no reason to go back to the big powers versus the little powers stance. I don't believe there's anyone alive in Western Europe that wants to start a war. I think that the ideas of revenge or the inability to get along with each other stopped a long time ago. I think that after the 1870 war, the French wanted to redress their losses in that war, and then you had the First World War, and then the Germans wanted to redress their losses after the First World War, and we had the Second World War. And I think that what NATO did was it proved that you could have peace and strength and security at the same time. And I think that there has to be a natural evolution from a stance of a military imposed peace to a peace that people get along with each other. And I think you see that now with the EU, because you see people go from nation to nation on trips. You know, there's no German that seems to want to take a vacation in Germany. He goes somewhere else. And the last time I was in Berlin, I was pleased to see that there were Russian visitors that were welcomed there. And in my lifetime, I never thought that would be happening. I think that when you find common people who have a common interest with other people's, that makes their government impossible to start a war. So I think that the exchange of people on vacation and in schools is a very, very good thing, because the people learn not to be paranoid. The unfortunate thing is that the Russian society has become more closed again after the 1990s, that they're almost going back to not quite the Cold War, but a partial Cold War that's a more formal, stiff relationship. And I don't believe that's good. I don't believe that's good at all for Europeans.
So to refer that you mentioned, I want to talk about the Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap is a theory that explains the relationship between a declining hegemonic power and a rising hegemonic power. But according to this approach, the tension between the two powers can lead then to a hegemonic war in which the great power wins and secures its primacy, or maybe loses and replaced by a rising power. But this concept is being used to explain the relationship between the US and China. In that case, do you think that a military confrontation between these two countries could occur? Or maybe could there be any peaceful and cooperative alternative to this theory?
I think the fact that the countries are so interrelated economically makes it not impossible, but close to impossible for major powers ever to start a war again. The wonderful thing about the economy, the world economy, is that you just can't shut off large parts of it. As long as the nations can compete economically on a fair basis, I don't believe that there'll be a war. I don't believe that the Chinese, who are expansionist as far as the economy goes, would ever want to start a war with anybody in Asia, because the fact of the matter is, where would that war be held? Ask yourself that question. Where do they actually go, and how do they actually get there? In Central Europe, there was a different thing, because the Russians were contiguous with the Eastern Europeans, and the Eastern Europeans were contiguous with the Western Europeans, and there was a way for armies to move back and forth. The Asians can't move into Western Europe militarily on the ground. Yes, they can project military power with missiles and aircraft, but that's a silly thing to do because they gain nothing from it except an exchange back. So I think that you have to look at what are the economic lines that countries use to trade, and how do they trade on the seas? The problem with the Chinese is the Chinese do have irritating policies about letting their hackers hack into Western computers, which is a threat to our economy. But it's not enough of a threat to cause a war. I don't believe the United States would ever go to war with China. China is traditionally a friend of the United States, by the way. If you go to China, they actually celebrate the American help that the Chinese got in fighting the Japanese, which is really a dichotomy. You know, the nations right now that I think are unstable and would lead to wars are the ones that are led by dictatorships. I think that the biggest challenge to peace, particularly in Western Europe, is another war led by Muslim jihadists. I think that religious extremism, more than military aggression, is the biggest problem you have now. And I think that NATO can do well to approach the terrorist problem, and where there are terror cells and where there are extremists that are trying to infiltrate societies and deal with them that way. I don't think that it's a problem of bombers or battleships anymore. So that's pretty much how I see it.
Yeah. So I have other question for you. Can you talk to all our audience about your participation as a historian in the World War II?
Yes, it's important to understand that I studied history in college, and because of the fact that the Vietnam War was coming to an end and the Army didn't need lieutenants right away, I went to graduate school and studied military history. So I came into the Army as a 22-year-old lieutenant with a master's degree in military history. And I learned that from history, you could get lots of lessons on how to be a better soldier. And virtually every assignment that I was in, if it was an overseas assignment, I went and looked at the battlefields and talked to people that were in the wars and studied things. And later, because of this, the reputation that I had garnered in the Army in doing this, I ended up an instructor 3 times. So my career was, I think, equally balanced amongst 3 kinds of assignments. I had assignments with armored cavalry units, and I had 4 of those, and I'd served in the United States and 3 times overseas in units. I had assignments on staffs ranging from battalion level to 4-star level. And I also had assignments in schools. And one of the things that I think you learn when you try to be a teacher, to teach people, is that you learn the right to tell stories, that you tell what you learned. So I did write about the Ardennes-Alsace Campaign, and I wrote a large part of another book that's this one, that's called American Armies in Europe, which explains to tourists why the American Army was actually in Europe in 1944 and 45. I learned a lot more than I taught, but the interesting thing is that as I was moving through the Army as a young officer, there were still a lot of people that had participated in World War II. As a young lieutenant, I spent an afternoon with General Patton's chief of staff, who was living retired near the Army post that I was, and he explained to me how Patton ran his staff. And later on, I used my position as a service school instructor to write retired people, to talk to them about what they had done. So I had talked to the last of the World War II generals that were still alive. I had served with soldiers who were actually in World War II in Korea. And what you do is you absorb their lessons and their experience, and then you try to pass it on to younger people. And it's not only so people remember what these people have done, but you can see how the services changed and adapted. You can see its effect on our own country, but you could also see the effect on foreign countries. While I was in Germany, I talked to lots of people who my father would say were on the other side, that had fought against us. And I got to talk to people who were not generals in the German army, but who had been majors and colonels during the Second World War, and also common soldiers during the Second World War. I actually talked to somebody who worked directly for Hitler. And we talked about the things that went on at that time. And I always asked them what their opinions were on why they did the things they did, why the countries changed the way they did, and what lessons can younger people like me take from it. And what I try to do in the things that I'm writing now is to explain why people acted the way they did. That why things worked and why things didn't work. I think the problem with history is if you don't tell it as a human story, it gets lost as just a bunch of dates and things that happen. That people have to recognize that that war or political conflict is a way that the world has evolved over time. And it's evolving now. It's changing significantly now. Because my grandfather, who served in I had two grandfathers that served in World War I. I had a father and an uncle that served in World War II. And myself and my two brothers served in the Cold War. We all had similar experiences, but different experiences. And I think the big thing is that the world has changed. The world has evolved. In a lot of ways, the world has gotten better. We've gotten over this idea that you have to have a war every 10 or 20 years so countries can reassert themselves. And I think that that's part of the learning process.
Exactly. It's really a good part about the experience that you had.
Right.
And other thing that you mentioned that is really important to talk about that, you are the author of Ardennes-Alsace Campaign and other publications that help in military history for the association in the United States Army. What final contribution can you give to all our audience about your book, and how important it was, your books and this kind of history for all our audience?
Well, I think the most important thing was not what I wrote, was what I helped other people to do. While I was working at the Association of the United States Army, which is the Army's professional association, but it's separate from the Army, I ran their book program, and I helped to bring into being 150 books at that time. So I worked with new authors and help them find their voice on paper, to tell the stories that they wanted to tell, and to publish things about things that even I didn't know about, for the benefit of younger people and also for scholars to understand how events have happened. So I think that besides being a professional soldier, I consider myself a teacher. My mother was a teacher. We have a lot of teachers in our family, in fact. And I think that teaching people is the most important thing. And I think that if you're a good teacher, you teach people to make things better, that make things better for themselves and their families, but also for their countries. And I think that you have to remember that armies are like the police, that you don't like to admit that there are bad people in the world, but you have police because there are bad people in the world. And armies act as the policemen for their governments in a lot of ways, not against their populations, but to defend their countries. And history shows us that there have been cases in almost every single generation where there was a threat from the outside and somebody had to deal with it. You just can't ignore that and then be surprised when it happens. You have to have somebody that's prepared to deal with it. So I think that my contribution is to kind of explain that process. The thing also is that the average person that gets caught up in these things is no different than you or me. That if there is a massive war, everybody gets involved and everybody's a victim on both sides. And I think that people have to understand that too. The leaders of countries have to understand their responsibility is to promote peace, not to promote dominance of just their own country. And I think that's the thing that I try to talk about, and that's what I hope my contribution will be.
About your book, The Ardennes-Alsace Campaign, do you think that the German Army's offensive in 1944 could have had some success and repeat the success to 1940?
Well, the 1944 offensive in a lot of ways parallels the 1940 offensive, but there's a major difference. The difference in 1944 is that the German army was very tired. It had been at war for 5 years. It had suffered tremendous casualties. The units were composed of very young boys or old men. A lot of the veterans in the units did not have their heart in it, and they lacked complete air superiority, which the Allies had. I think that if you had taken that plan and executed it with the quality and type of soldier they had in 1940, I think it would have worked. I think in 1944, it was asking too much of the soldiers. Having said that, the Germans accomplished a lot in the first 2 weeks of the offensive, and they caused very, very significant casualties to the United States Army. Several divisions were literally destroyed, and several had to be pulled out of the line because they had suffered such high casualties. But the dominance of the numbers of the Americans and also the response of the other units, which was very, very aggressive to the Germans, showed that it was a complete waste of human beings. That the Germans had launched this offensive because they hoped that they could destroy enough divisions that they would have parity on the Western Front, so their new victory weapons or missiles and whatnot and jet aircraft could come into being and buy some time. It was a complete illusion. It was a complete illusion. I had talked to a large number of people in the Ardennes. I spent about 6 weeks on the ground. I interviewed a lot of the locals who had seen what was going on. I had talked to several of the generals that were in it. I had talked to several of the German officers that helped plan it. And it was a complete misunderstanding of the situation of reality that the Germans had when they did that. And it turned out to actually, I think, cause the war to be shorter, because the Germans had suffered such tremendous losses that forward of the Rhine, that they no longer had the strength to fight after we crossed the Rhine several months later. It's a very, very interesting campaign, and it's actually has a parallel in the First World War, that the Germans launched all of these massive offensives in 1918 in the hope that they would change the complete situation in the war, and all they did was speed up their own demise. And Hitler had been in those campaigns in 1918. Why he thought that he could get away with that is probably only based on his misreading of the dominance of missiles and jet aircraft, which of course weren't delivered in time. And the Germans, of course, didn't have the fuel and the capacity to introduce those in large quantities. It's a great soldier's battle in the sense that the big lesson is that the battle was won by the fierce defense put up by the soldiers, not by anything brainy that the generals did. It was a very, very basic response that the generals had to the battle, but it was really a triumph of the individual valor of the soldiers that were involved. And it was a very, very costly battle. There are actually two. There's the Battle of the Bulge, and then there's the Little Bulge, which was Operation North Wind, which was launched in Alsace. And the Germans suffered a total of about 100,000 casualties, which is about what the Allies suffered. It's about equal. But it's the last real battles that you see in the West. Not that there wasn't fighting after they crossed the Rhine, because in some places the fighting was pretty hazardous, particularly up in the north. But it was a terrible battle, but it was a soldier's battle. It really was had to do with the endeavors and the valor of individual soldiers, which is why it came out the way it did.
Excellent, and thank you, Roger, because it was a really great experience and words for all our audience. And we have reached the end of this incredible and interesting section of INISEG Cast, accompanied by the great expert and leaders. So thank you, Roger, for once again being a part of these interviews and provide all our audience with a complete content about your military career, your participation as a historian in the World War II. So thank you, Roger.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And we finish.